We've wanted to go to Japan for a while, and after spending copious amounts of time looking at it online, we finally booked our tickets, and before we knew it, we were on our 18-hour flight out there. I had a blast in Japan. The sights, sounds, and just a general culture shock. It's truly an amazing place to travel to, and a real visual feast for anyone who loves photography and filming. It's one of the main reasons I decided to buy the Sony A7 III, and a long story short, I really loved using it out there. Sony debuted this as a basic model, but it feels anything but basic to me. It's a truly powerful full-frame camera, and it helped me capture my time in Japan wonderfully. Just to confirm, I'm obviously back from Japan now, but I really wanted to let you know what my thoughts were about this camera while I was out there, and how it's been holding up since. Now, I'm not going to dive into all the technical aspects, it's not that sort of video. I just wanted to give you some genuine feedback as a hybrid shooter about what's most important to me. So, welcome back to Bite Review. This is my review of the Sony A7 III in Japan, sort of. Let's talk about the body and handling first. If you've used any of the A7 series or any mirrorless camera, you'll know that they're not the best to hold, but Sony has made the grip a lot deeper on this one, which is useful for someone like me. I don't actually use a strap when I take a camera around with me. I find it kind of gets always caught up in my coat or my backpack and it just annoys me. So I usually just hold the camera, and while I was out in Japan I actually made use of a little Wiimote strap, don't laugh, to keep it attached to my wrist, which I did upgrade to the Peak Design cuff after that. Another reason I hold the camera is because I can be a lot more reactive to stuff then. If something happens quickly, I can just pull the camera up, take a picture or take some video and push it back down. It means I don't have to fuss about taking the strap off or like getting it off my shoulder or something, and then by that time the moment can be gone. Also, thanks to the size of the A7 III, it's a lot more inconspicuous to shoot with. Something else I really love about the A7 III design is the amount of customizable buttons on it, and I really recommend diving into the menus and changing those custom buttons to suit your shooting style. If you combine that with the My Menu settings, which is like this favorites list of all your most used functions, you can pretty much stay outside of Sony's somewhat bloated menu system, and it will make you faster at shooting in general. And of course, having dual SD card slots and USB-C are very welcome additions. There's obviously things I'm not too keen on the design aspect of the A7 III. I wish Sony would just embrace a fully articulating screen, which would be amazingly useful for someone like me. And it'd be nice if the exposure compensation had a lock on it, because sometimes that's really easy to turn if you got the camera down by your leg or something like that. You can just flick it and before you know it, you're underexposing. But otherwise, on the design front, I think it's a good looking camera and I really like the way it works. This is a YouTube video, so let's talk video. Shooting on the A7 III is an absolute pleasure for video, and it's got a wealth of features that really hone it as a great camera for a lot of forms of videography. Sony's 4K is some of the best in the business in my opinion, and it's sampled down from a 6K image, which just gives it that extra detail and it always looks clean and crisp. There's also slow motion support in 1080 up to 120 frames, which is great too. Sony's picture profile selection is some of the more powerful video tools if you want to get into them. There's S-Log 2 and 3, which give you that really flat picture profile if you want to grade in post, but there's something to suit everybody's style in there. Personally, I've settled on a Cine 4 profile and I really like the way it looks. This is the one I actually use for everything now, not only travel stuff, but for all of my YouTube videos and client work outside of YouTube too. It's got a nice highlight roll off, the lowest ISO is 200, which is really useful, and it's flat enough for me to grade to my heart's content in post. There's inbuilt stabilization in the camera too, and that's really useful when you're shooting with lenses that don't have any stabilization. I know Sony's IBIS isn't the best out there, but I like the way it works and it's hard to see it kick in, and it doesn't actually get rid of all the shake, which I think is synonymous when shooting handheld. In my eyes, you want a little bit of shake because that's how handheld footage should look. The only thing I will say is while the 4K is gorgeous out of the A7 III, the 1080p from Sony isn't great, and a lot of other manufacturers do 1080 a lot better than Sony does. If you want to shoot 1080, I would only ever use it for the slow motion for the 120 frames. And if you want 1080 normally, I would just shoot in 4K and then compress it down in your editor. That way the footage will look absolutely wonderful. My absolute favourite feature for video from the A7 III though is being able to shoot in a crop mode. And effectively what that means is when you shoot in a crop mode, any lens you've got attached will have a different field of view. So like the 24, which is what I'm shooting with now, will suddenly turn into a 35mm. A 55mm will start acting more like an 85mm, and an 85mm will start acting like a 130mm. This basically turns every lens you have into two lenses as such, and that's a really powerful tool for videography. While I was going around in Japan, I was generally only taking round my 55mm because that acts as a 55, and then in APS-C crop mode, it would act as an 85, which was just wonderful. Let's talk about the bad points too, of course, and I know a lot of people were disappointed that the A7 III still uses 8-bit for video. I think a lot of people were hoping that Sony would make the jump to 10-bit, but in its defense, Sony never sold this as the camera for video. The Sony A7S series is for that, and hopefully with the Sony A7S III, which remains as elusive as ever, we'll get not only 4K 60 but higher bit rates and a 10-bit video recording. Or at least we can hope. Side note, if you're watching this video after that camera's out, I really hope it's everything we wanted it to be. Maybe even an articulating screen, but I guess we'll see. If there's one thing that I really wish Sony would change, it's how the A7 series works with external monitors. And if you've used one with an external monitor before, you'll probably know what I mean. If you're shooting in 1080, not much really changes. The camera screen turns off and you use the monitor screen for everything. But if you're shooting in 4K, then suddenly things start changing. For instance, you can't use face detect in autofocus anymore, and you can't see any settings on the external monitor. You have to look back at the camera's monitor to see if you're overexposed or underexposed. I can only assume it does that for the sake of external recorders, but I really wish you could switch the information on or off, and it's just a bit of a nightmare. Before we jump into photography, let's talk about the autofocus first, because I think you'd be really hard pushed to be disappointed with it. The A7 III autofocus is probably one of the best upgrades to the series, and it's razor fast and accurate now, where it was always a little slow beforehand. The new eye detect for portrait work is absolutely fantastic, and they've recently added animal eye detect as well, which in my use has been just as good. More importantly, for someone like me, continuous face tracking in video works an absolute treat. I'm using it right now to film this, and I know once I've got it set up and going, I don't have to worry, unless I'm using a monitor, of course. If you want to use this for vlogging, you can. Just whack on the autofocus and it will do the heavy lifting for you. The autofocus also held up really well in darker scenes. I was really worried doing like night style photography over in Tokyo that it might struggle and hunt a little bit to find a point to focus on, but it performed really well, and I didn't have any trouble shooting in those darker scenes at all. So yeah, long and short, the autofocus is great. I took about 1 million photos while I was out in Japan, and in a really good way. I don't actually have that much to say about the photography side of things because it did everything so easily for me. The quality is fantastic, the eye detect autofocus is amazing, and the low light performance is really good. What I will say though, while these images fly past you, is that I think the A7 III is one of the few cameras out there that really stands as a proper hybrid. There's no compromise in photography despite having those really great video specs. A lot of other cameras out there will either lean heavily into video over photos or vice versa, but I don't get that impression with the A7 III. There's due care in both areas, and I really like Sony for doing that. The only thing that comes across in a bad way in the photography standpoint is the colour science, but colour science is a subjective problem. On the surface, I don't really like what the Sony produces. It's hard for me to be happy with the colour from an out of camera shot, and I don't get a sense of feeling like I did when I tried the Fuji X-T3. However, every photo I take ends up in Lightroom anyway, and I've got a fantastic array of presets that I've built up that works really nicely for Sony. So after a few moments in Lightroom, I can make these photos look exactly how I want to. Like I say, it's not a huge problem, and at the end of the day it is subjective, but it's the only area I think could do with a little bit of improvement in Sony cameras in general. It's worth mentioning the battery life as well, because Sony are now using the Z batteries for the new A7 series, and they are absolutely fantastic. I could go a whole day in Tokyo taking numerous photos and videos from early in the morning till pretty late at night and not have to change the battery once. I actually stopped going out with a spare and was just using the one that was in the camera at the start of the day, and I had no problems whatsoever. Overall, the A7 III worked for me admirably in Japan, and I would find it hard to not recommend to anybody. If you're looking for a camera that can handle photography and video in equal measure, then you can't go too wrong here. It's a really full-featured full-frame camera, and it comes in at a competitive price point. After spending a few months with it and making it work for me, it's become a full workhorse camera, so I use it for everything here on YouTube and I use it for everything outside of it. I feel like I say this a lot, but I'll wrap the review by saying it again, no camera is perfect, and every single one you look at is going to have some sort of compromise somewhere. The important thing is to make sure you pick the camera that has the compromises you can work with. For me, the A7 III has the least compromises for how I shoot, which is why it's such a good camera for me personally. So that's the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, pop a like. If you loved it, pop a sub. If you've got any questions about the A7 III, then please ask me in the comments below and I will endeavour to answer you. And I will see you all in the next one.